Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, February 17th, 2025. All right, so if you're watching, you notice that the scenery is a little different around here. I'm visiting my parents in Florida and working from here for the week. So the one thing is the central air is really loud up here and kicks on and off, so I hope that the sound isn't too bad. Hopefully it doesn't get picked up by the microphone, but everything else should work out well up here. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. and Russia to hold Ukraine talks in Saudi Arabia. So top Trump administration officials are set to travel to Saudi Arabia next week to hold talks with Russian officials to discuss bringing the war in Ukraine to an end. And this was reported all over on Sunday. So the delegation is expected to include Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's Middle East envoy, but he's been doing some diplomacy with Russia. He was involved in bringing that American back home who was imprisoned in Russia. So Marco Rubio spoke with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in a phone call on Saturday, following up on President Trump's recent call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So there's diplomacy happening between the U.S. and Russia, which is very good. It's always good when they're talking. The State Department said in a readout of the Rubio-Lavrov call, quote, "The secretary reaffirmed President Trump's commitment to finding an end to the conflict in Ukraine. In addition, they discussed the opportunity to potentially work together on a number of other bilateral issues," end quote. So Ukrainian officials said that they were not invited to the talks in Saudi Arabia. Zelensky said in an interview that aired Sunday that he would never accept any decision between the United States and Russia about Ukraine if Ukrainian officials did not participate in the negotiations. So Zelensky feels like he is getting left out of these talks. So it still remains unclear at this point how this war will end, what exactly the U.S. is willing to offer Russia. But the fact is, this is a dramatic shift from the previous administration's policies. You know, it's unfortunate that the war continues. People are still dying. We need the dying to end, as Trump has said many times. But unfortunately, it continues. At the same time, it's good that the U.S. and Russia are actually talking. President Biden refused to speak with Putin after the invasion. Trump's call with Putin was the first known public call between the U.S. and Russian leaders in 3 years. And even Rubio discussing the war in Ukraine with Lavrov, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the former Secretary of State, he didn't even, he had a few brief conversations with Lavrov about prisoner exchanges. I mean, just, one phone call about a prisoner exchange. They spoke for like 5 minutes on the side of a G20 summit. And that really goes to show that they had no interest in ending the war. If you really wanted a war to end, they would have been on the phone every day. So that was one of the most shameful things about the Biden administration. So again, at least talks are happening, and hopefully this leads in a positive direction. All right. So the next one here, Ukraine rejected a deal to hand half its mineral wealth to the U.S. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has rejected a proposal for the U.S. to take ownership of 50% of the rights to Ukraine's rare earth minerals and other natural resources. And this was reported by the Financial Times on Saturday. So the report said that this offer was made when U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent visited Ukraine last week. While Zelensky rejected the initial offer, he has expressed openness to a rare earth deal with the U.S. and is reportedly working to negotiate a better deal. The White House National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes said that by rejecting the U.S. proposal, Zelensky was being short-sighted about this opportunity that the Trump administration has presented Ukraine. So Zelensky's main demand for a deal is for robust security guarantees from the U.S. and Europe. A person familiar with the proposal delivered by Bessent told the Financial Times that it only referenced the U.S. getting mineral access for past military assistance and did not include an offer for future U.S. support. So it's saying that this deal was, as Mike Waltz has put it, an attempt for the U.S. to recoup the costs of the proxy war. He wouldn't call it a proxy war, but it's obviously what it is. So, there's kind of conflicting reports. This report says that this proposal from the U.S. did not deal with future military assistance. At the same time, when Bessent was in Ukraine, as I covered on this show, he was saying that Ukraine should accept this deal. It'll get a security shield out of it from the U.S. So that did imply that it did involve some sort of future military aid or security guarantees. And then there was also this report from NBC News that said Trump administration officials have suggested an openness to deploying U.S. troops to Ukraine to guard U.S.-owned natural resources if there is a peace deal with Russia, although Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has ruled out the idea of a U.S. deployment to the country. So again, kind of conflicting things. And there's been a lot of fake news about Hegseth. It seems like, I covered when on Wednesday he addressed the Ukraine Defense Contact Group saying no NATO membership for Ukraine, restoring the pre-2014 borders is unrealistic. And then there were all these stories like, Hegseth walked back what he said. But, if you looked at it, he didn't really walk anything back. It seems like all the Europeans were just freaking out. The NATO people were just freaking out about it and trying to, get him to take back what he said, but he really didn't do it, as far as I saw. So anyway, so back to the rare earth thing. President Trump, of course, as we've been covering, has repeatedly called for a rare earth mineral deal with Ukraine, saying that he needs to secure the money the U.S. has poured into the proxy war. In a recent interview with Fox News, the president suggested that he wanted $500 billion in natural resources from the country. So who has been talking about the minerals in Ukraine for a long time? Senator Lindsey Graham. Over the weekend, Lindsey Graham credited himself with convincing Trump to pursue Ukraine's rare earth minerals. So we have Lindsey Graham to thank for this whole idea. Graham told Politico, quote, "The main thing for me is that Ukraine has value, literally has value. Trump now sees Ukraine differently. I said these people are sitting on a gold mine. I showed him a map and said, look," end quote. So Graham, he has a history of doing things like this. Back in 2019, Lindsey Graham visited Donald Trump in the Oval Office and showed him maps of oil fields in Syria and said, you got to stay in Syria because look at all these oil fields in these U.S. occupied areas. And then Trump said, we're going to stay in Syria to secure the oil. So unfortunately, it seems like Trump listens to Lindsey Graham, or at least Lindsey Graham is in his ear about this situation in Ukraine, which is not a good sign because Graham has been one of the most fervent supporters of this whole thing. All right, so the next one here, Trump advisor gives 4 tenets to deal to end war in Ukraine. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So National Security Advisor Mike Waltz discussed some of the core issues for Donald Trump in the upcoming talks on ending the war in Ukraine. And he did not confirm that Ukraine would be involved in the talks. On Fox News Sunday, Waltz explained, quote, "Number one, it has to be a permanent end to the war, not a temporary end to the war. Number two, this can't be ended on the battlefield. This has turned into a World War I style meat grinder of human beings. Number three, I talked about how the structure of our aid has to change. Then number four, we're talking about economic integration going forward as the best arbiter of peace." End quote. So he says, this is something Russia says as well, that they don't want a frozen conflict. And so Waltz is saying the U.S. also does not want a frozen conflict. It has to be a permanent end to the war. And, of course, that's the best case scenario. There's a lot of people who think this is going to end in some sort of Korea-style armistice where the war doesn't ever actually end and there's this demilitarized zone. But hopefully a permanent end is reached to this war. All right, so the next one here, Marco Rubio says Hamas must be eradicated. So speaking to reporters alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem on Sunday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Hamas must be eradicated, a goal that would require Israel to restart its genocidal war on Gaza. Rubio said, quote, "Hamas cannot continue as a military or a government force, and frankly, as long as it stands as a force that can govern or as a force that can administer or as a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible. They must be eliminated. It must be eradicated, end quote. And that's language straight from Netanyahu. That was always his line was, we will eradicate Hamas. So in his remarks to the press alongside Rubio, Netanyahu said that the U.S. and Israel shared a common strategy on Gaza, including when the gates of hell will open if all the Israeli hostages are not released by Hamas, repeating a threat from President Trump. So you see this picture here. Netanyahu gave Marco Rubio a nice hug at the beginning of the press conference, a nice little embrace. So Netanyahu said, quote, "I want to assure everyone who is now listening to us, President Trump and I are working in full cooperation and coordination between us. We have a common strategy, and we can't always share the details of this strategy with the public, including when the gates of hell would be opened, as they surely will if all our hostages are not released until the last one of them," end quote. The Israeli leader also mentioned President Trump's what he called a bold vision for Gaza, referring to his calls for the U.S. to take over the Strip, which would involve an ethnic cleansing campaign. Netanyahu said that he and Rubio discussed how they can make Trump's plan a reality. Discussing Iran, Netanyahu said that Israel had dealt a mighty blow to Iran and that with U.S. support, Israel could finish the job. So kind of ominous language there. While Rubio was visiting Israel, the Israeli Defense Ministry announced that it received a shipment of Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs from the U.S. These are the huge bombs. Biden paused one shipment of them. After sending them about 14,000 of these bombs, he paused a single shipment to make it seem like he was doing something to put pressure on Israel. And then Trump came in, released that pause, and he's pushed forward a whole bunch of new military aid for Israel. So this Rubio-Netanyahu meeting came a day after Hamas released 3 Israeli hostages in exchange for 369 Palestinians being freed from Israeli jails. So the hostage exchange went through on Saturday. Thank God the deal has not completely collapsed. Trump had previously said that all hostages should be released on Saturday, or that Israel should open the gates of hell on Gaza, signaling that the U.S. is ready to back Israel if it restarts its bombing campaign and siege. And then on Saturday, when this exchange was going down, Trump went on Truth Social and said that it was up to Israel. You know, if they don't all release all the hostages by noon, then it's up to Israel what to do. Because that's what Trump was saying. Oh, if they don't release all of them by noon on Saturday, they should, let all hell break loose or whatever, however he put it. So then the day that things seem to be back on track, Trump goes on Truth Social and says it's up to Israel what to do at that deadline. And he said that the U.S. would back whatever decision Israel makes. So that's the message that Trump is putting out. While the ceasefire is extremely fragile, Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, insisted on Sunday that the second phase of the truce will absolutely begin. But so far, Israel has not sent negotiators to discuss the second phase of the deal with mediators. Netanyahu's office said in a statement on Saturday that Israel was sending a negotiating team to Cairo to discuss the continued implementation of phase 1 of the deal. So the language there is important because there was under the ceasefire deal, they were supposed to begin the negotiations, with Hamas through the mediators on the second phase of the deal on the 16th day of the ceasefire that started on January 19th. So that's like February 3rd when these talks were supposed to start. They haven't started yet. And now even the language, again, he's saying that he's sending mediators to discuss the continued implementation of phase 1. That's not even saying that they're going to go start talking about phase 2. His office put out in the same statement said that the Israeli Security Cabinet was going to discuss the idea of phase 2. But again, that's not, Israel is in violation of the ceasefire deal by not engaging in real negotiations on the second phase. So again, everything is very fragile. So the next one here, Israeli strike in Gaza kills 3 police officers despite ceasefire. An Israeli drone strike on Sunday killed 3 Palestinian police officers east of the southern Gaza city of Rafah in a violation of the ceasefire agreement, Gaza's Interior Ministry has said. The Interior Ministry said the policemen had been in the area to secure aid shipments entering Gaza. The ministry said, quote, "The ministry condemns this crime and calls upon the mediators and the international community to compel the occupation to stop targeting the police force. which is a civil apparatus, end quote. And I'm sorry, I should have given you a warning. If you're watching here, this is a picture of one of the police officers who was killed. And Hamas also released a statement condemning the strike. Hamas said, quote, "The treacherous firing carried out by a Zionist drone this morning east of Rafah City, targeting police and elements tasked with securing the entry of aid, is considered a serious violation of the ceasefire agreement," end quote. The Israeli military acknowledged the strike, saying that its aircraft bombed several armed individuals that it claimed were moving toward troops in the southern Gaza Strip. So the claim is always, oh, people are walking towards Israeli troops. That means we could fire on them. They're saying that they were armed, but if they're police guarding aid shipments, obviously they're going to be armed. And throughout its genocidal war in Gaza, Israel targeted the police. The excuse, them saying, oh, they're under the control of Hamas, but this is their civil these are police, and this was a total breakdown of the security of the aid shipments. This was one of the biggest problems in regard to the food situation in Gaza, was the fact that, their trucks were entering Gaza, but the distribution wasn't happening. And one of the big reasons why was because Israel destroyed the police force. And Israeli media actually reported, Haaretz had a report that said Israel was letting armed gangs loot aid shipments and even fired on police when they tried to stop the looters. So since the Gaza ceasefire went into effect on January 19th, Israeli forces have killed around 100 Palestinians inside Gaza. And that's what they call a ceasefire. All right, so the next one here, 369 Palestinian prisoners expose the occupation's brutality. So this is an article from the Palestine Chronicle. So a lot of the Palestinians who were released were in very bad shape, signs of torture, signs of starvation. And one of the really sick thing that the Israelis did when they released these guys is that they forced them all to wear these shirts that had a Star of David on them and a slogan written in Arabic. And the slogan said, "We will not forget or forgive. We will not forget or forgive." So that's what they made these guys wear. And they took photos of them and released them. I mean, it goes to show they think that this makes them look good, doing this to these people that they're releasing. And when they the shirts you see here in this video, they light them on fire. But again, just this humiliation ritual that they decided to do with these Palestinians that they released. All right, so the next one here, Israel deliberately dismantled healthcare system in northern Gaza. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. A humanitarian aid worker said the healthcare facilities in northern Gaza had been decimated by the Israeli onslaught. And this is specifically in northern Gaza in the cities of Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Jabalia, where they were just destroying everything starting this past October. And this is someone with Doctors Without Borders. And in these hospitals, they were not only are the buildings destroyed, but the actual medical machines, like, X-ray machines, MRI machines, things like that, were destroyed. They say, this is the quote again from someone with Doctors Without Borders, said, quote, "There is no healthcare system anymore in the northern part of Gaza. Kamal Adwan Hospital has been razed, while Al-Shifa, Al-Ada, and Indonesian hospitals are seriously damaged and only partially functioning. We were utterly shocked to observe that in Indonesian hospital, every medical machine seemed to have been deliberately destroyed. They were smashed to pieces one by one to make sure no medical care could be provided anymore," end quote. And I saw Caitlin Johnstone wrote an article about this, about them going in and systematically destroying all the medical equipment. I mean, what's the excuse for that? Was there a Hamas guy hiding under every single one of them? It just goes to show how it was a deliberate targeting and destruction of the medical infrastructure. All right, so the next one here, Israel used an 80-year-old as a human shield. So this is one of the sickest stories I've read, recently, and that says a lot considering all the horrific stuff that I have to cover. So a senior Israeli officer in Gaza tied an explosive around the neck of an 80-year-old Palestinian man to force him to act as a human shield, and the man and his wife were later killed by Israeli soldiers. And this was reported by an Israeli media outlet called The Hottest Place in Hell. So this is an Israeli media, from an Israeli media report with Israeli sources. And this report said that Israeli soldiers present at the scene said the incident occurred in May 2024 in Gaza City's Zaytun neighborhood. Israeli soldiers found the elderly couple in their home, and they said that they could not evacuate due to mobility issues. One of the soldiers said, quote, "They said they had nowhere to run and that they couldn't evacuate to Khan Yunis. The man was walking with a cane, and they said they simply wouldn't be able to walk all the way there," end quote. So, again, the man has a cane, and then the Israeli soldiers separated the man from his wife, and they tied an explosive to him, threatening to blow his head off if he tried to run away, even though he had a cane. One of the soldiers said, quote, "They explained to him that if he did something wrong or not as we wanted, the person behind him would pull the rope, and his head would be severed from his body. He walked around with us like that for 8 hours. Even though he was an 80-year-old man and even though he couldn't escape us," end quote. After 8 hours of checking for explosives, the man was returned to his wife. Then Israeli soldiers ordered the elderly couple to evacuate to the south on foot. The report said the soldiers did not inform other nearby battalions that the elderly couple was headed south, and after only walking for 100 meters, they were shot and killed by Israeli troops. I mean, again, just this barbarity, this cruelty, this is an elderly couple over 80 years old, and they say they couldn't evacuate to the south because, of course, they're over 80 years old. They're going to walk all that way, and they send them on their way anyway after using them as a human shield under the threat of death, and then they just get shot and killed, just murdered. And this is a combination of these horrific practices we've seen from the IDF in Gaza. The human shields, this has become it became so prevalent in Gaza that they had a nickname for what they called these Palestinians. They called this the mosquito procedure. They refer to the Palestinian civilians that they use as human shields that they find in Gaza as mosquitoes. They refer to them as a type of insect because that's how they view Palestinians. And they have another name for Palestinians who they bring in to Gaza for this specific purpose. They call them wasps. So they actually, in some cases, bring in Palestinians from prisons into Gaza to use as human shields, literal human shields. And then the other policy of the IDF in Gaza is that in certain areas, and they call these no-go zones, anyone who walked in, even if they were an unarmed civilian, even if they were an old couple, one of them is walking with a cane, they get shot and killed. And this is just one of the most horrific stories I've seen. And this is what the U.S. is supporting every time they give Israel any kind of weapons or any kind of political support. All right, so the next one here, the TikTok ban was fueled by Israel, not China. So this is an article from Ken Klippenstein's Substack. And this is basically something that we already knew, but it's really something here. This was the Munich Security Conference. Senator Mark Warner was talking with Mike Gallagher, who's a former member of Congress. He left recently. He works for Palantir now. But he was involved in crafting the TikTok bill, the bill to ban TikTok. And essentially what he said, so Warner said to Gallagher, they're talking about TikTok, how the legislation got passed. And Warner says, I want to see if you're going to tell the real story, Mike. You're going to tell everybody really what happened and why this legislation got passed. And Gallagher said, basically, because of Israel. He said, quote, so again, he's talking about the TikTok bill. He said, quote, "So we had a bipartisan consensus. We had the executive branch, but the bill was still dead until October 7th. And people started to see a bunch of anti-Semitic content on the platform, and our bill had legs again," end quote. And of course, when he says anti-Semitic content, he means content critical of Israel, critical of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And this is why this bill got through. And again, we knew this already. It was obvious. Mitt Romney said something similar, but it's just some admission here saying they're cracking down on the freedom of Americans in the name of protecting them from China, but in reality, it's on behalf of of Israel, of a foreign power that's in the middle of conducting a genocide. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. launches a drone strike in Syria. So the drone wars are not over. So this article is from Jason Ditz. A U.S. drone strike against the Idlib government in northern Syria has killed 2 people, according to reports from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. U.S. Central Command CENTCOM says that one of the slain people was a senior operative of al-Qaeda affiliate Haras al-Din. The attack took place outside of the town of al-Juz. It is the second confirmed U.S. drone strike against the Idlib government since President Trump took office last month. The previous strike on January 30th killed Haras al-Din member Mohammed Salah al-Zabir, according to CENTCOM. He, too, was called a senior operative at the time. So this happens after Haras al-Din announced on January 29th, which was before both of these strikes, that it was dissolving. And Haras al-Din was kind of the official al-Qaeda affiliate. So it was really something because they put out the statement saying that they were dissolving, saying that their goals were completed in Syria. You know, our work here is done. You know, our friends in HTS took over Syria. And I know people might dispute that Haras al-Din and HTS were friends because they did fight against each other, but very similar ideologies. Haras al-Din was a spinoff of HTS, which was a spinoff of al-Nusra Front, which was the initial al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria that was founded by the guy who's now the so-called president of Syria. So, you know, it's just all a mess, and the U.S. is still doing drone bombings there. Now they're targeting Haras al-Din. It's kind of strange. You know, I think the Haras al-Din guys are probably trying to be absorbed by the government forces. So, you know, it's not really clear yet how the Trump administration is going to approach this new al-Qaeda-linked government in Syria. I mean, we know the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was very against the U.S. intervention in Syria because it helped al-Qaeda, and now al-Qaeda basically runs the country. Again, you know, Jelani, or al-Shara as he's going now, he's gone on his little, you know, he's been rebranded and you know, whitewashed by the Western media, but it's not exactly clear how the Trump administration is going to approach everything in Syria. But the drone bombings continue. All right, so the next one here, CENTCOM says 5 ISIS fighters killed by a U.S.-backed airstrike in Iraq. So the war on terror in general continues. We also saw, I believe, was it the first drone strike, airstrike under the Trump administration? They bombed Somalia, saying that they targeted ISIS in January. But this has been going on in Iraq, and it's barely getting any coverage. U.S. Central Command said in a press release on Saturday that its forces backed an airstrike near Rawah, Iraq, that was launched by Iraqi security forces on February 12th. The command claimed the strike killed 5 ISIS fighters and said that its initial post-strike clearance confirmed dead ISIS operatives, that they had various weapons. So the attack marked the 3rd time CENTCOM said that it backed an airstrike launched by the Iraqi government since President Trump took office on January 20th. So again, they're saying it's a U.S.-enabled airstrike, whatever exactly that means. You know, obviously that means they're providing intelligence, but how far does this support go? So the U.S. military has continued military operations against ISIS in Iraq in recent years, even though the president, al-Sudani, he's been saying for the past couple of years that he doesn't need the U.S.'s help to fight ISIS anymore, that they can leave. But because of this huge leverage that the U.S. has over Iraq, it has the ability to wreck the country's economy because it controls its money, basically. And actually, Trump, with his new, you know, so-called maximum pressure campaign on Iran, one thing that they did with the sanctions was they ended a waiver for Iraq to basically purchase electricity from Iran. So that's going to be a big problem for Iraq. They might have some serious problems with that. So that's just going to stir up the anti-American sentiment in Iraq even more. And there's a chance of attacks on U.S. bases restarting. But in the meantime, this war against ISIS continues. You know, ISIS hasn't controlled any significant territory in years, but it does seem like they've benefited from the destabilization since, you know, October 2023. They stepped up attacks in Syria after that and everything. So they still exist in some form. But again, Iraq says, we don't need your help fighting them. So the answer is for the U.S. to withdraw from Iraq, withdraw from Syria, and get out of these conflicts. All right, so the next one here, Israeli troops kill 13-year-old girl in Lebanon. So this is another one from Jason Ditz. The extended ceasefire in Lebanon has just a couple days left, and while Israel is maybe withdrawing from population centers, but they are keeping... So Israel's planning to keep its military in new hilltop surveillance posts. And in the meantime, the violence continues. Israel continued attacking and killing Lebanese civilians at a heavy pace. There were multiple incidents, but perhaps the most flagrant was in the village of Hula. A group of displaced Lebanese civilians and paramedics from Hula were attempting to return home, and as so often happened in recent weeks, Israeli troops attacked them. Israeli troops opened fire on the group of unarmed civilians, killing at least one and wounding several others. The slain was identified as a 13-year-old girl named Khadija Atwi. Reportedly, her father was killed by Israeli troops as a resistance fighter during the 2024 invasion. And this is a picture of her with a photo of her slain father. And, as I mentioned, as the U.S., as they're providing military aid to Israel, they're supporting this occupation of southern Lebanon, all the violence there, all the violence in the West Bank, the occupation of Syria. And this is all stuff that the U.S. is complicit in. So on top of the killings and injuries sustained, Israeli troops also detained a number of civilians and captured 2 of the paramedics tending to the injured. Lebanon has called for the release of the paramedics, noting their capture is contrary to the terms of the ceasefire. All right, so the last story here on the page, we have a little Taiwan story. Oh, whoops, I went too far back. All right, State Department changes line on Taiwan independence. So this article is from South China Morning Post. So this is interesting. The State Department a line saying that Washington does not support Taiwan independence has been removed from the U.S. State Department's website. The website updated its fact sheet on relations with the island on Thursday, continuing to state its adherence to the One China policy, but removing the phrase, "We do not support Taiwan independence." The updated page says, quote, "We continue to have an abiding interest in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, free from coercion, in a manner acceptable to the people on both sides of the strait," end quote. According to Taiwan's central news agency, the fact sheet previously said that the U.S. opposed any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. "We do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means." So could potentially be a sign of things to come of the U.S. under Trump, the new Trump administration, increasing support for Taiwan in ways that will be very provocative toward China. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, U.S. Democratic allies becoming increasingly authoritarian. One from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies, Trump gives peace a chance in Ukraine. One from Jonathan Cook, Trump didn't invent the Gaza ethnic cleansing. It's been U.S. policy since 2007. One from William Hartung, the Air Force needs to doge the new Sentinel ICBM. And our spotlight from James Carden, America First's Forgotten Founder. So please go check all of that out. So much stuff. Whenever we come back from the weekend, it's just like a mountain of news to go over. You could always support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting. Follow us on social media, on Instagram, on X, on TikTok. And tell your friends about antiwar.com. I will be back with some more news tomorrow. Thanks for listening.